Harari's answer for those who feel lost in 2026. There is a particular kind of lostness that has no clean name in any language. And yet, millions of people are experiencing it right now, today, in 2026, in the middle of ordinary lives that look, from the outside, more or less functional. It is not the lostness of crisis, not the acute disorientation of a specific catastrophe that can be pointed to and named and eventually survived. It is something quieter, and in many ways more difficult to address, because it lacks the clarity of a definable problem. It is the lostness of a person who wakes up in the morning and goes through the motions of a life that is, by most measurable standards, adequate, and yet feels, with a persistence that is difficult to explain to anyone who does not share it, that something essential is missing. That the self moving through the day is somehow not quite real. That the map they were given for navigating existence does not correspond to the territory they actually find themselves in. That the frameworks, the identities, the narratives of meaning that were supposed to provide orientation have quietly stopped working without anyone announcing the change or offering a replacement. If this description resonates with you, you are not alone. And you are not broken. You are, in a very precise sense that Yuval Noah Harari has articulated more clearly than almost any other thinker of this era, a person living through a specific and historically unprecedented rupture in the relationship between human beings and the stories that have always organized their lives, given them direction, and made existence feel meaningful rather than arbitrary. What you are experiencing as a personal crisis of orientation is also a civilizational phenomenon, one that is affecting hundreds of millions of people simultaneously in 2026, in ways that existing institutions, therapies, religions, and political movements are struggling to adequately address. Understanding this does not make the lostness disappear, but it changes the relationship with it in a way that turns out to matter enormously. Harari's work, from Sapiens through Homo Deus and into his more recent thinking, returns consistently to one of the most important and most underappreciated facts about human psychology. We are not, primarily, rational creatures who form beliefs about the world based on evidence and then act accordingly. We are, primarily, meaning-seeking creatures who require narrative frameworks, stories that connect past to present to future, that locate us within something larger than our individual lives, that tell us who we are, what matters, and what we are supposed to be doing with the specific existence we find ourselves in. These narratives are not optional accessories to human consciousness. They are structural requirements. Without them, human beings experience not merely sadness, but something closer to psychological dissolution, a loss of the basic orientation that makes coherent action possible. Harari describes this phenomenon using the concept of the intersubjective order, the shared stories and belief systems that exist between individuals, not inside any single mind, but in the space of collective agreement, and that provide the frameworks of meaning within which individual lives acquire shape and direction. Throughout most of human history, these frameworks were provided with reasonable stability across a lifetime by religious traditions, cultural communities, family structures, and occupational identities that changed slowly enough for each generation to inhabit them with genuine confidence. A person born into a medieval Christian community knew, with a clarity that we might now find startling in its certainty, who they were, what their life was for, what happened after death, what constituted a good life, and what the consequences of failing to live one would be. The framework was not chosen, it was received. And its unchosen quality was paradoxically one of its greatest strengths, because the absence of choice meant the absence of the anxiety that choice produces. You did not need to figure out what to believe or how to live or what your life was for. The tradition you were born into told you, and the community you lived within reinforced the telling daily through ritual, relationship, and the simple fact of collective agreement. None of this is to romanticize the past. These received frameworks also enforced conformity at great human cost, excluded those who did not fit their categories with brutality that was frequently physical, and prevented the kind of individual self-determination that many people today would rightly consider a fundamental requirement of a dignified life. The liberation from received frameworks of meaning that modernity has made possible is a genuine liberation, not merely a loss. But liberation and lostness are not mutually exclusive. You can be genuinely free and genuinely lost simultaneously. In fact, freedom and lostness are so closely related that the experience of one without some degree of the other may be the exception rather than the rule. At least until a person has done the difficult internal work of building from the materials of their own experience and reflection a framework of meaning substantial enough to provide the orientation that received traditions once provided without requiring individual construction. This is the specific challenge of 2026 that Harari's thinking addresses most directly. We are living in a moment when the received frameworks of meaning that previously organized human life are losing their authority faster than new frameworks capable of replacing them are being constructed. Religious belief has declined dramatically in many of the world's most technologically developed societies, leaving millions of people without the metaphysical scaffolding that organized everything from their sense of cosmic purpose to their weekly rhythm of communal gathering. National identity, which served as a secular replacement for religious identity for many people in the 19th and 20th centuries, has been complicated and contested by globalization, migration, and the growing awareness of the historical violence on which national narratives were often constructed. Class identity, which provided a framework of collective belonging and shared purpose for many people through the 20th century, has been fragmenting under the pressures of economic transformation and the decline of the industrial communities in which it was rooted. Family structure, which once provided one of the most stable sources of identity and direction available to ordinary people, has been diversifying and destabilizing in ways that produce more individual freedom, but less structural support for the construction of meaning. And into this context of dissolving received frameworks has arrived, with almost comically bad timing from the perspective of human psychological readiness, the technological revolution of artificial intelligence, which is not merely changing how people work and communicate, but which is raising with new and unavoidable urgency the question of what human beings actually are and what makes us distinctive and valuable in a world where cognitive capacities once considered exclusively human are being replicated and surpassed by machines. This is not an abstract philosophical question when you are a person whose professional identity, whose sense of competence and contribution, whose experience of yourself as someone who knows things and can do things is organized around capacities that AI systems are demonstrating they can perform with equal or greater proficiency. the question of what makes you specifically human and why that matters is not merely intellectually interesting in 2026. For tens of millions of people, it is the central existential question of their daily lives. Harari has observed that this collision of dissolving frameworks and accelerating technological disruption is producing a specific psychological condition that he regards as one of the defining challenges of our era. He describes it as the condition of people who have access to more information, more choice, and more freedom than any previous generation in human history, and who are, paradoxically, experiencing greater difficulty constructing a stable and sustaining sense of personal identity and purpose than many people in much more constrained historical circumstances. The paradox resolves when you understand that freedom without framework is not liberation, but exposure. The removal of external constraints on selfhood does not automatically produce a coherent self. It produces the possibility of a coherent self, which must then be constructed from the inside, without the scaffolding that external tradition once provided, using materials and methods that no previous educational or cultural tradition has adequately prepared people to work with. So what does Harari actually offer to the person who is lost in 2026? What is his answer? It would be dishonest to present it as a simple solution, because Harari himself is notably resistant to the provision of simple solutions, and his resistance is principled rather than evasive. He believes, and his historical analysis supports the belief, that the era of simple, universal prescriptions for how human beings should live is itself one of the things that is ending, and that the discomfort produced by its ending is partly the growing pain of a species being forced by the collapse of received frameworks to develop a more mature, more autonomous, more self-constructed relationship with meaning. But he does offer several orientations, several ways of approaching the condition of lostness that are worth examining carefully and taking seriously. The first orientation Harari offers is one that initially sounds almost offensive in its simplicity, but that reveals on examination a profound and counterintuitive depth. It is the orientation of observation rather than identification. One of the central sources of the specific lostness of 2026 is the experience of having one's sense of identity destabilized by forces that feel beyond individual control. When the story you have been living by about who you are, what you stand for, what your life is for, begins to feel inadequate or false or simply insufficient, the natural response is to search urgently for a better story to identify with, a new framework to inhabit, a new ideology or community or belief system that can restore the feeling of solid ground beneath the self. This urgency is understandable, but Harari suggests, drawing on traditions from Buddhist contemplative practice to Stoic philosophy, that the identification strategy, the attempt to solve the problem of lost identity by finding a better identity to adopt, may be working in the wrong direction. What if the instability of identity is not primarily a problem to be solved by finding a better story, but an invitation to examine the relationship between the self and the stories it tells, to develop the capacity to observe one's own narratives rather than simply inhabiting them, and to discover, through that observation, a more fundamental ground of self-awareness that is less dependent on any particular story being true. This is not an easy thing to describe without sounding either evasive or mystical, and Harari acknowledges the difficulty. But the practical implications are real.